Thank you for watching this video from the Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue at Carleton University. This event is sponsored by the Canada-Europe Transatlantic Dialogue, CETD, and the Faculty of Public Affairs Research Month at Carleton University. CETD receives funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. The views expressed in this video are solely those of the presenter and do not reflect the views of the CETD, SHRC, or Carleton University.
So I'm going to introduce my colleague Donna Wood from University of Victoria, and she is with the TRG, the same one that had the thematic research group as the previous panel, which has two parts, one on democratic participation, which is the one that I've been mainly responsible for, and the other half of that thematic research group looks at democratic legitimacy and governance in multi-level systems, so it's more focused on governance issues as opposed to participation issues, and that is headed by Amy Verdun, who is our colleague from the University of Victoria, who's a leading EU scholar in Canada. Unfortunately, Amy can't be here today, and so Donna Wood, who she has worked with over the years on this project, including on this particular dimension of it, is going to chair that panel on her behalf. So thank you very much, Donna, for doing that.
Joan, thanks very much, and thank you to all of you for staying, because I think we have, as a final panel, I think we have a very interesting panel. I mean, the focus of this work that we've been working on, and as I said, as Joan mentioned, I'm here on behalf of Amy Verdun, who has led this particular initiative over the last 7 years. I mean, basically what we're interested in is how these complex multi-level governance systems of Canada and the European Union work. And what are the mechanisms that they use to work, particularly for decision-making when you've got such complexity with Canada having 13 provinces and territories and a central government, a federal government, a clear federal political system. And then you've got the European Union with now 28 member states, you know, expanded over time with, again, not a federal system, but moving towards more of a federal political system. When one looks at it from a Canadian perspective, there are all kinds of federal dynamics that you can see the similarities that we have in terms of how the EU is developing and how the decision-making and the multi-level governance process that takes place in Canada has a lot of similarities. So the benefit of this particular panel, and the benefit I think in many ways of the work that we've done, is this panel is explicitly comparative. We've asked all of the panelists to take a look at this issue of multi-level governance and within their particular areas of expertise and do comparative work between Canada and the European Union. So I think we're going to start with Arthur. Arthur is from Germany, Darmstadt University, and he's going to talk about varieties of multi-level coordination in Canada and Europe. So Arthur, why don't you get us started?
Well, thank you very much, Donna. And I think I should include Amy. Also, she isn't here. And I also want to take the opportunity to, of course, thank Joan, not only for organizing this fantastic event, but for bringing me into this fantastic network. Thank you very much. What I was asked to do, and I am trying to do, is to give a kind of overview over the research on multi-level governance, and it's a research on quite complex issues. This is where politics becomes complex. But in order to deal with complexity in research, we have to reduce complexity by bringing the reality to concepts, and therefore my talk will be a little bit theoretical. I hope it will not be boring, therefore. First of all, I want to remind you where this all know I should begin with a definition. What is multi-level coordination? I talk about coordination in a sense of intended interaction of policymaking from different levels, determined to achieve some degree of convergence. There must not be a harmonization or a full coordination of policy. Sometimes we end up with at least some attempts and incremental convergence of policies towards a common goal. There should be a common goal of a political system, of a federal system. And research on multi-level governance has started in a kind of transatlantic dialogue, and I would like to remind you that two pioneers had started this work. One is Richard Simeon in Canada with his work on federal provincial diplomacy. Richard has developed, based on literature on international relations, quite interesting and influential work on intergovernmental relations in Canada, and it includes a kind of theory of negotiations. And then in Germany it was Fritz Scharpf, and Fritz Scharpf read Richard Simeon. So he was influenced by these works. He started in 1976 to publish on German federalism, and then he published his famous article on the joint decision trap, which was on the European community. What I also want to emphasize here is that Richard Simeon in those days already compared Canada to the European Union. So there was a kind of indirect dialogue going on between two important researchers. And based on these works, and now I ignore a whole library of literature on American intergovernmental relations, which we indeed should include, but I cannot talk about everything. There was an ongoing exchange between scholars working on the European Union and on Canada, and they discovered different modes of governance. So starting from works on negotiations, they discovered other modes. I'll refer to them. And these had been works in Canada by people like Banting, Beckwith, Skogstad, and in Europe, Adrien Héritier, Joan with her work on Canada and Europe and Russian relations, and Ingeborg Thurman and Amy Verdon have also done research on this. And the second strand of research was comparative research, which showed us that there are important differences in the conditions under which these multi-level governance systems worked. And again, I could refer to a number of scholars. I only want to mention two of them, because I find their work quite important. And these are Laurier, Thorlakson, and Jörg, Broschek, which we have on a panel. They did very important work on this. I also want to mention in passing that when I talk about coordination, I ignore the whole literature following the works by Gary Marks and Lisbeth Hug. I only mention this because multi-level governance is often identified with works going back to Hug and Marx. They have been interested in works on integration and regionalization, so structural change. I'm interested in policy coordination, so this is quite different research question. I said we have discovered, or the researchers have discovered different modes of coordination, starting with negotiated agreements, negotiations as a mechanism of intergovernmental coordination, a mechanism of collective action that works under different conditions. One is the joint decision model elaborated by Fritz Scharpf, which means that all governments of a federation have to cooperate because they are institutionally compelled to cooperate. They cannot make policies on their own. There is no exit option. This is a model of joint decision making, which became quite influential. Richard Simeon and others that worked on the Canadian case, and later people who worked on the European Union, dealt with another kind of negotiation systems which allowed exit options, allowed governments to go on their own, and these are different conditions, but nevertheless attempts to negotiate agreements. Then we have the mechanism of mutual adjustment without negotiations, and this goes then to different kind of competition, coordination by competition. There are two types that have been elaborated as models in the literature. One is institutional competition, which is kind of market-like competition of governments. Think about tax competition and the discussion about race to the top and race to the bottom. I will not use it in this context, because more important for policy making is what economists have called yardstick competition, which means competition in policy fields for best practices. And well, the model of reference is a beauty contest, not a market. It works in a quite different way. I come back to this in a minute. And the last one is the real soft mode of coordination by persuasion, which again can be based more on a top-down model based on hierarchical authority in a way of policy recommendation leading to policy transfers, or consultation and deliberation leading to policy learning. These are, so to speak, the modes of coordination that we can distinguish, but they of course work under quite different conditions, and I want to briefly mention two conditions. One is the division of power between government. Of course, we can distinguish between sharing of powers in different ways. Separation between policy fields or separation between functions includes a kind of hierarchical structure and can create a shadow of hierarchy, or sharing of power, which then of course creates the model of joint decision making. Governments of member states either participate in legislation, think about European policy making with the participation of governments in the Council of Ministers, or joint executive policy making outside the legislative field. You know that Canada is a federation where powers are mostly separated in different ways. Some of them are also shared or are de facto shared. And the European Union is a federation where most powers are shared, either by the participation of the Council of Ministers, but again by the participation of national parliaments in a subsidiarity control mechanism, which is a mechanism that in a way keeps the sharing of power, the allocation of power flexible, which allows to shift powers between levels. So there is some flexibility in this condition. Also in Canada, the constitutional allocation of power can, of course, defined by governments. So these are conditions that can be shaped. There are other conditions that are even more important. These are the conditions that are created by the democratic systems. Here democracy comes in, but as an institutional constellation, governments are accountable to parliaments, which is the basic mechanism of democratic legitimacy. Sorry. And again, I want to emphasize differences between Canada and Europe. Canada has a Westminster system, where not only the government is responsible to Parliament, but where the Parliament is sovereign and can decide over intergovernmental agreements. That's the reason why sharing of power and joint decision-making doesn't really work in Canada. Also, there are some policy fields where it is necessary. In the European, we have parliamentary systems mainly at the national level. These conditions are given and can hardly be changed. They can be changed by the introduction of participation by civil society, which is relevant in some fields. Nevertheless, there is a dilemma of democracy, and this is a dilemma which has two implications. One is that parliamentary accountability can constrain the discretion of governments and the effectiveness of multi-level coordination. And the other thing is that participatory democracy usually is a participation of civil society organizations, where the question is whether these representatives of organizations are really representatives of citizens. Usually we have here an elitist bias. Now, considering these conditions and these different institutional constraints, we have to be aware that policymakers are usually aware of the problems that are created by this, and therefore, and this is what recent research has shown, they use these modes of coordination they have available in different ways, in a strategic way. They anticipate conflict, and they anticipate opposition, and they respond to this by first of all modifying the policy, reframing a policy, usually avoiding policies with redistributive effects. Yesterday, Inge Weibust introduced the case of water governance, and I thought, well, in a European context, this is framed as a regulatory policy, because the European Commission, of course, regulates in order to avoid national governments to privilege their industries by allowing them to avoid costs by exploiting water resources, while in Canada this is a pure redistributive problem, redistribution of scarce resources. So this is an example of reframing, which we find quite often. Then we often find that governments change the agenda in order to avoid blockades or conflicts and difficulties. And finally, they alter the mode of coordination. So there's a lot of dynamic going on. And now I have to be very brief. I want to explain this or illustrate this with two examples. One is the joint decision-making model, which had been studied in the European context, and here I refer mainly to the work of Gerda Falkner. Joint decision-making, you can find it in many cases where we have redistributive problems, for instance, in Canadian fiscal equalization reforms or the reforms of structural funds. And these are joint decision constellation because all governments have a stake, and we have redistributive conflicts, so difficult issues, and the parliaments are affected. And usually we find that governments end up in intergovernmental bargaining and often are confronted with the risk of deadlocks. And this is, of course, a problematic situation which policy makers have to be aware of. And they do this, well, one of the simplest things is they make compromises and end up with package deals, compensating governments that are losing. They shift negotiations to a non-political arena in order to avoid politicizations, avoid the influence of party competition and the impact of parliaments. The European Commission uses its networks in structural fund policies, and in the last Canadian fiscal reform of the fiscal equalization, they successfully installed an expert panel. They consult with strategic partners, so they try to avoid the multilateral setting by trying to build coalitions in consultations with strategic partners. An important strategy is to make decisions in a sequence, first deciding on the principles of distribution and then on the real allocation of funds, which we can find in the European structural funds, and the shadow of hierarchy, which worked in the Canadian case because, of course, the federal government had the power to make legislation. So you see, in order to come to decisions, policymakers change these modes of policymaking in quite different ways. They include different elements of other modes, and so this, in a way, can work. The other example is, because Amy and Donna had worked on this, the open method of coordination. Well, if you think about what the speaker in the panel in the second morning session has told us, open method of coordination works with shaming and blaming. So in a way, this means that the basic idea of this method was to stimulate a kind of policy competition between governments, national governments. And this policy competition, according to the theory that had been elaborated by economists, works if public and parliaments use these comparative evaluations and this shaming and blaming of their governments, and in order to drive governments to improve their policies according to the common standards. But as you know, this can be an advantage because it creates transparency of policy making and brings parliaments and citizens in, but de facto there is a problem of democracy because, well, you can imagine that a majority party is not willing to blame and shame its government. And that's the reason why, in a way, the open method of coordination has changed into a kind of deliberative mode, and this is what we find in the literature. It's a consultative process, a deliberative process with attempts to bring citizens in instead of parliaments. There's always the claims that parliaments are not involved. So this is a second illustrating example how a mode of coordination in this kind of yardstick competition turns into a kind of persuasive mode, policy deliberation. So, well, in Canada that has not worked, as you can read in the publications of Donna and Amy. To conclude, we find a variety of modes of coordination which we have to consider in research. We find we have to take into account different conditions under which these modes of coordinations can work and do work, and that has, of course, effects for the outcome. And we also find that policymakers use these modes of coordination, so to speak, this set of modes in a strategic way. They change it in order to avoid deadlock, and I refer here to a recent term of Ingeborg Tömmel. Policymakers are not involved in governance, they are also involved in governance of governance, and that has implications for democratic legitimacy. Of course, I ignore many problems of the democratic legitimacy. What I want to emphasize is that there might be a new question as regards to democratic legitimacy, because we have to think about who has the power to shape these modes of coordination and change the mode with consequences for power structures and outcomes. How is this power legitimized? And finally, there's always the search for a balance, not only of these different modes, but also a balance between the democratic process, democratic institutions, and multi-level governance. And so is there a right balance at the end over time, or is it an imbalance? That is my conclusion. Thank you very much.